So let me tell you a little bit about how to grow beans. Beans are a warm season crop, and so we tend to grow, or at least I tend to grow my beans kind of right in the middle of my growing cycle. Um, After I've grown all my frost hardy vegetables and my early season vegetables, then I'll go ahead and start with the beans. Beans like temperatures above 65 degrees. They really do really well between 70 and 85 degrees. So I kind of wait around a little bit before I plant my bean seeds. Now, beans are generally sowed directly into the garden because they don't like to be transplanted. Their roots are shallow and are easily damaged. And so if you want to start them indoors, you can go ahead and the best way, of course, is those biodegradable pots that you can transplant the whole entire container into the garden. I didn't have any of those, and I'm kind of cheap, so I didn't buy any of those. Plus, I have to grow. Plus, I grow mine in hydroponics. By the time they start, once they're tall enough and they have enough developed root systems, I replant them into hydroponic coolers, and so I'm going to have to take them out anyways, and so they're not going to go in the soil. So what I'll do is typically what I do with the seed starting trays like you're looking at right now, what I'll do is I'll basically I'll go ahead and water it down thoroughly, and I'll have a kind of a scooper, and I'll take those seedlings when they're about 6 inches tall, 6 to 9 inches tall, and I'll go ahead and water them down and rinse them off, and then I'll put them in the hydroponic coolers. But if you were to take your seedlings that are growing in seed starting containers, then what you would typically do is just go ahead and try to not disturb them as much as possible, and then go ahead and plant the whole thing directly into the ground. Now, with beans being a warm season crop, don't start them too early. Most of the time, beans don't need to be started indoors. I go ahead and I start mine always in seed starting trays or Jiffy peat pellets, just because I'm going to go ahead and put them into a hydroponic system later on for yourself. If you want to go ahead and sow them directly into the ground, make sure the ground soil is 60 degrees or higher. And then by the time they're developing 2 to 4 inches tall, hopefully you're getting about 70 to 85 degree weather, because they thrive and grow really well and take off at those temperatures. Now, some people will go ahead and they will soak their seeds 1 to 2 hours or overnight to hydrate them a little bit, because as you notice, your bean seeds are fairly decent size, not like tomatoes or peppers that are tiny, and so they'll hydrate them. If your soil, you're using a peat type disposable container, or you're using some sort of disposable container, or you're using even the seed starting trays, you're going to go ahead and drown or basically wet and dampen your soil pretty thoroughly during its moisture and watering phase before you actually sow those seeds anyways. And so I feel like you don't really need to bother with soaking the seeds overnight. So I typically go ahead, and when I'm going ahead and sowing my seeds into these seed starting trays and containers, I don't really bother to soak them overnight, because the soils are already pretty damp as it is. And so with that in mind, once they are planted into your soil medium, whether it's the seed starting trays or disposable pots, you're going to plant them typically about 1 inch deep. You're going to go ahead and once they start sprouting, germinating, they will germinate within about as little as 3 days to about a week. They're fast growing. If you do start them indoors, make sure that you bring them outside and give it plenty of sunshine, because they get kind of leggy if you go ahead and leave them indoors, because there's not enough real natural sunshine to keep them from tipping over. Now, with the beans, if you can at all help it, and you're growing it in your raised bed or your garden, directly sow them into the ground. They have shallow root systems and they're easily damaged, so transplanting them, be careful. And Also, we don't want to make sure that we don't sow them too early where the soil temperature is under 60 degrees, because bean seeds can rot very easily if the soil is too wet, too rainy, and it's not the soil temperature isn't warm enough. Now, with most bean seeds, they're going to be 1 inch deep versus like tomato seeds and other pepper seeds where you can get away with about a 1/2 inch or 1/4 inch. You're going to go ahead and want to plant them at least 1 inch deep. Now, with bush beans, I typically plant mine about 2.5 to 3 feet apart, with the seeds placed about 1 to 2 inches apart. And after the plants have germinated, then I'll thin the seedlings to about 3 to 4 inches tall. 3 to 4 inches apart. Now, with pole beans, they do need the support, and so pole beans can get anywhere to 6 to 8 feet tall. So you're going to need a trellis or some sort of fence or some sort of support to keep them up. But I plant those about 3 to 4 bean seeds per pole and space them about 2 to 3 inches apart. Now, beans like full sun, and so you want to make sure that you're picking an area in your garden that gets a lot of full sun, and you want to make sure that that you're in an area where not only are you getting full sun, but you're also getting a good area that's hopefully not infested with a lot of bugs and rodents and other things. And so, as always, make sure you're putting it in a good spot and you've done the preventative measures to keep rodents, rabbits. I have rabbits in my area. And then as you go ahead and see the seeds germinating, make sure that you're watering it on a regular basis. Beans don't like dried out soil, so make sure that always has moisture. Also, beans like moderately rich soil that's slightly acidic. So you can go ahead and amend your soil with organic matter. Make sure, of course, always to remove the weeds so they're not competing with water and nutrients in your area. Plus, it keeps the bugs away. Now, along with watering on a regular basis, you want to go ahead and make sure that the soil is getting watered. Now, with the roots not being very deep, you don't have to worry too much about overwatering or doing a deep watering system. But make sure that it's not underwater, because if you underwater your bean plants, they actually will stop flowering. Also, make sure that that in the hot summer days that you're going through there at least a couple times to 3 times a day to make sure that the top of the soil hasn't dried out. Now, the green beans will germinate best when the soil is about 70 to 80 degrees. If the soil is just right around the 60-degree mark, they will germinate, but they just take a few extra days to go ahead and germinate a little bit more. Like I said earlier, anything under 60 degrees, there's a good chance for your bean seeds to go ahead and rot because it takes too long for it to germinate. So make sure that you're looking for soil temperatures above 60 degrees. And then the plants grow best when the air temperature is between 65 and 85 degrees. They are a warm-loving plant, so make sure that you're not starting them too early. And then talking about fertilizing, beans are legumes, and so beans kind of fix the nitrogen in the soil, so you want to avoid a high nitrogen fertilizer if you are fertilizing your bean plants. And so instead of using something that's high in nitrogen, go ahead and use something that isn't. I used to use something like a generic plant soluble fertilizer, and then I would go ahead and just add a little bit of compost dressing along the way because I want something that's low in nitrogen. Okay. Now, one thing you want to do when you start harvesting your beans is the more you pick the beans, the more flowers it'll set. So you want to make sure that you're harvesting on a regular basis, because if you don't, and you let the beans over mature and start forming the seeds inside and maturing the pods inside, it kind of tells the plant to stop producing more fruit and starts putting the energy toward developing the pods inside. So you want to go ahead and harvest them on a regular basis. And of course, they taste the best when they're young and tender, about the size of a small pencil. Over mature beans can kind of taste tough and stringy. So you want to go ahead and harvest them regularly. Now, in terms of insects, for me, the biggest problem I face with my beans is really the rabbits. What happens is if I have them low on the ground, the rabbits will come when the leaves are forming its first and second set two leaves, like it is doing right now. These are tender and they're very tasty for rabbits. And so what I typically do is I take this jewelry bag and I go ahead and put them on top of the beans once it's formed its second true set of leaves. But I also try to keep them off the ground because rabbits will come by even during the daytime and they tend to nip at my bean leaves that are nice, young, tender, and tasty for them. Also, I've had situations where crows have come by and snipped off the tops of them. And once they snip off the tops of them, they don't grow back. So it'll end up ruining the plant. So immediately when this plant is starting to form its second set of true leaves, and as you can see the middle there, you can see a leaf forming. Last year I had rabbits and a few crows come through there and ended up biting the tops of those beans off, and that's why my beans were started so late, because I had to restart growing a lot more beans to make up for the ones that I lost. Now I keep these beans above this old car that's not used anymore, and the reason for that is I'm trying to keep the bugs away, but I'm also trying to stay away from the rabbits. Now, other insects and pests that you're going to have to deal with are mostly all the beetles, spider mites, and Japanese beetles. They love beans, and so it's very important to keep an eye on them. If you're going to go ahead and plant them in pots, raised beds, or in your garden, if at all possible, use some sort of covering, a garden cover, or you can do what I do, which is take these jewelry bags and I just place them on the tops of the beans. By the time they're a good foot tall, they have tougher leaves, the ones that aren't very popular for the beetles and for the rabbits, and so they don't really they don't mess with my bean plants once they are more mature. Throughout the growing season, though, in order to make sure that Japanese beetles and the other beetles aren't getting at my plants, I do spray my beans with neem oil every so often just to kind of give it that extra protection. But for the most part, early on is when you want to make sure you're paying attention to how your beans are forming, and that the insects and bugs aren't getting at them. Of course, slugs are a big problem too. So make sure that you're doing preventative and protective measures on your beans. Now, let me talk a little bit about these particular type of beans. These are bush beans, and now I tend to grow more bush beans these days because with bush beans I don't have to deal with a trellis or pole. Now, these type of bush beans typically get to be about 20 inches tall, and I like them because I can start harvesting within about 50 days. So what I did was, as we've got into the middle part of the springtime, I went ahead and took the bean seeds. I prepared the Jiffy peat pellets and the seed starting trays. I watered them down heavily, drained them a little bit in the sink, and then I made sure to, once they were drained thoroughly, they're still pretty damp, so that way I didn't have to pre-soak my bean seeds. And then I went ahead and put them in the soil medium. And then within about 3 to 7 days, as you can see, they've all germinated. Now they're going to reach, once the plant is mature and it reaches a height of about 20 inches. So one thing I love about bush beans is I don't have to stake them. I don't have to keep them upright. That's the great thing about having bush type beans. Now when the fruit is forming and the beans are forming and they're about 5 to 6 inches long, that's when I'll harvest them. I tend to harvest mine right about 4 3/4 and 5 inches, just because I don't want to have the risk of them maturing, because the beans taste the best when they're young and tender. And once they get to their full mature size, then the plant will kind of sense that, and then it'll start shutting down its flower production, and then you won't get the beans all season long. So I make sure to go through on a regular daily basis to pick all the beans that are mature. And I tend to, instead of waiting for them to be 5 to 6 inches tall, I wait for them to be about 4 3/4 to 5 inches. So that way I'm regular picking them, and then it will keep on producing more flowers and producing more beans throughout the whole growing cycle. So that's a little bit about growing beans. If you have further questions, feel free to let me know, and I'll answer any of your questions.